So I thought, okay, well, let's see what's in these obvious groups. And I started looking at this one, and it's pretty obvious that these are all the right-wing books. Started looking at that one, and it was pretty obvious that those are all the left-wing books. And so I just colored them blue and colored them red and published this. And a lot of people thought, wow, this is interesting. And so again, with basically with about an hour's time spent with Amazon, was basically finding out the same information that we were a kind of a divided nation in 2004 that all these other studies were doing. And so this was the original layout on the right, and that's how the software showed the emergent pattern. And then on the left, what I did is I just put the two sides into arcs and displayed them in alphabetical order. So it was easier to read. So this is a little more messy, but this shows the emergent pattern. That's a little more cleaner, but the links you see on the right are the same links that you see on the left. So it's basically the same thing.
It's interesting you have so few in the middle. Are they integrators? Are they just wishy-washy? And who are they?
Well, they're kind of integrators. Because this one here, one of the gray nodes is Bush at War, which was one of, what was that guy's name? Woodward, yeah. It was one of Woodward's 3 books about the Iraq War. And this was one of the ones where he was fairly positive about Bush. His last one, State of Denial, he was fairly negative. So it was actually bought by both sides, but a little more by the right. And then this other one, All the Shah's Men, talked, again, it was probably kind of a middle-of-the-road book, but more people on the blue side. And then this Sleeping with the Devil was right in the middle. So, in fact, I think Sleeping with the Devil was, again, it was something about the Mideast and something we had done wrong many years ago. So both sides were looking at that. But I was amazed at how divided it was. I was expecting a lot more interconnections. I was expecting this kind of clustering, but not as distinct as
it's very severe, and it makes you wonder if there's money in keeping people apart and keeping them at odds.
Well, one of the things that Amazon does is, they show you, people that bought this book also bought these books, but it is basically the data that they have. And it's also, but the other thing is, it's just data on higher selling books. So if there's a book that is really in the middle, but it only sells 50 copies, that's not going to show up here because it's not going to have the same amount of sales figures that the rest of them have. And what Amazon does is they give you like the top 100 books, and so there has to be some cutoff. I'll come right back to you. There was another question here. Okay.
Just because Amazon said, if you buy this book, other people bought these books, how do you know it's just not Amazon saying, if you buy this book, you ought to buy this book? How do you know that information is factual?
Well, yeah, and that's, Amazon tells us that it is actually sales. They have a couple other areas where they'll show, recommended books. Like, they'll show a book and then they'll say, buy these 2 together. And those aren't necessarily books that are high sales, but there's 2 ways that you can get this data. You can get this data by just going page to page and gathering it manually, or if you have access to the Amazon API, you can also suck this information out and then get it here. But yeah, I mean, there is some basic sense of trust we have to have in Amazon that these are the actual numbers and these are the ones that are sold. Now, I talked to their chief scientist, and he actually shows one of these in one of his presentations, and he told me, yeah, swear to God, it's the real numbers, but we have to trust but verify, right? Okay, so I looked at a lot of books in 2004, but I thought, what if I just look at the top 10? So rather than looking at the top 100, best-selling political books. What if I just look at the top 10? What patterns do I get then? And in 2006, these were the patterns. So we had kind of a right-wing cluster, we had the left-wing cluster, and we had this new cluster that was neither right nor left. And a lot of these were economic books. So The World is Flat, Freakonomics, The Tipping Point, Guns, Germs, Steel. But then there's this new little cluster that's kind of an anti-religious cluster that's forming. The End of Faith, The God Delusion, Misquoting Jesus, and then Letter to a Christian Nation. So these are all really kind of anti some of the red books. So this was an interesting pattern to see these three clusters 2 years later. And again, this was right after the November 2006 elections, when the Republicans lost and the Democrats won back a lot of seats. So there's lots of data on Amazon, lots of interesting patterns. We can look at political books, but you could probably look at technical books. You know, people that look at certain Linux books, what else are they looking at? You know, Java books, what else are they looking at? You know, BSD, Unix BSD, what are they looking at? You know, all sorts of things versus Red Hat. Oracle versus Sybase, all sorts of interesting patterns you can find. Another place that I found some interesting data was at Harvard. And what Harvard does is they tell us all about their illustrious faculty. And they tell us, you know, who these people are and how to contact them and their pages. But what they also tell us are areas of interest. So we see that Clayton Christensen here, and for those of you that don't know, he's a famous researcher and publisher around innovation. So a lot of his books on innovation have been top sellers. But we see, you know, what his areas of interest are. And so we see the primary topics, the additional topics, and then also what industries he's interested in. And we have this on every single professor at Harvard. So again, we can look for the overlap of interests or industries, or combine the two and find emergent networks. So again, these people might not necessarily know each other, but the more interests they have and the more they are located in one particular school, the better chance that they know of each other. So again, no one's giving us the social network data, but we're deriving it from things that we know about. So we take all this data, we can put it in the software, and here's a pattern of the business school faculty. So we see that there isn't like one big cluster. There's a cluster down here, and there's another cluster here, another cluster here, and then a cluster way out here. So so if you're trying to figure out a business school to go to, and the professors in the particular business school or in the particular discipline that you're interested in are up here, and maybe Harvard's not the place for you to go. But if the people that you're interested in taking classes from are down here or down here, they're much more central, they're much more focused, maybe Harvard's the right place for you. And that's the professors, but we have two pieces of information. We have professors and how they overlap in interests, and then we have interests and industries and how they overlap in professors and people that choose these things. So we can map the interests too. And we can see that the interests are much more clustered together. So again, if my major is going to be whatever 017 here is, then again, Harvard might be a good place for me to go because there's a lot of connectivity around that. But if my interests are around, 119 or 35 or 41 or even out here, then again, maybe Northwestern's a better school or maybe Case is a better school. So again, it's a way that we can get some into what's going on without having the actual data. So we can derive data from knowing what choices people are making. So next one. I have a very interesting client in Los Angeles, and I won't mention their name, but they're an economic justice organization. So they fight for the little person that can't fight for themselves. And they're basically, one of the battles that they've been carrying on is against this group of slumlords in the area that they're interested in. And how many of you have heard of the Morrison Hotel? Okay, so it's a record by the Doors, right? But it's an actual hotel there, and it's still standing, and it's now one of these slum properties that's owned by this group of slumlords. And little children that are living in that building are getting lead poisoning all the time. And the city, LA, of course, doesn't support that, so they try to get the owners of the building to fix up the building to bring it up to code. But what happens is that the city is always one step behind. So somebody owns a bad building, people are getting lead poisoning or something else is going wrong there. City comes and says, you have 6 months or 8 months, whatever, to fix it, or we're going to slap this huge fine on you. City comes back after 6 months and says, have you fixed it? Guy says, no, sorry, I don't own the building anymore, I sold it. Okay, so then the city tries to figure out who owns the building now, and has it been improved? No, it hasn't, and the problem goes on. The city's always one step behind. As soon as it's supposed to be fixed, sorry, I sold it. So what's going on is basically something like this, where you'll have these limited liability corporations that own these buildings, and they basically, one sells to the other, to the other, to the other, to the other. And you would think, who in their right mind would want to buy a building with all these violations in it? Just doesn't make sense. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to show you some software that's pre-beta. So if it doesn't work, it's not my fault. And what's going on here? Okay, here it is. So we have the same thing here again. And the network that's shown is the real estate sale. So ABC Limited Liability Corporation sells it to DEF Limited Liability Corporation, and so on. And again, what we've done here is this isn't the real data from the client. This is stuff I've made up, but this mimics the kind of analysis that they did to help the city bring down this ring of slumlords. So what happened was that they saw this, and everything looked fine. It's one company selling a building to another. What's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that. And then when they went to the city records to see who was connected to these businesses, they found that, okay, Beverly and Ed are connected with ABC, so is Andre, Diane and Carol are too. So, these people own these limited liability corporations, and everything seems to be fine. Well, then they dug a little deeper, and somebody told them that, what this really is this is a big family operation. These people are all related. But they had to look that information up, and then they had to show the city and the city prosecutor what was going on. So they were able to look that information up, and they found that these weren't just a bunch of individual business people doing business. These were indeed a family that was all connected through marriage and through bloodlines. And Heather here was kind of like the family matriarch, and she had been married twice, and she had this one family here and this other family here. And she herself wasn't connected to any of these LLCs. And that you often find in criminal organizations is the top person, the kind of the brains behind the whole thing, remains disconnected or not obvious. connected.